Is your mobile app really secure? New vulnerabilities pop up every day, and malicious actors look for easy targets on app marketplaces to exploit. Securing your app's valuable IP and data is critical. GuardSquare's security solutions are built for developers and protect your app at every stage in the development lifecycle. Multiple layers of protection prevent reverse engineering and automatically detect tampering, making your app a difficult target for attackers. Learn more at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. Software supply chain attacks are continuing to expose vulnerabilities in organizations around the world. The time has come to focus your efforts on security for your software packages. Cloudsmith is the only cloud-native software package management solution for your enterprise. With Cloudsmith Continuous Packaging, you can securely deliver software across the globe and mitigate potential threats from entering your supply chain. With over 23 plus formats supported, Cloudsmith is the solution that engineers choose to safely deliver all of their assets. Reduce unneeded downtime and deliver with confidence. Start securing your software supply chain today by visiting securityweekly.com/Cloudsmith.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. Keynotes from Alyssa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, Dave Kennedy, and Meryl Vernon. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register now and check out our exciting lineup. Well, John, we also, I think, have an exciting lineup of news for the week. It was pretty eventful, and I have a couple quick ones that I just want to mention, then a couple of things that might be a deep dive. In terms on the side of quick ones to mention and move along from, Robinhood had a security breach and extortion attempt. I couldn't really find any interesting details about it, so I'm going to just pretend it was another security. No, this wasn't a security misconfiguration. It was a social engineering. But the problem was that they didn't have FIDO keys, or they didn't have a strong two-factor authentication that would have been more resistant to this type of social engineering. So that was the thing that I just wanted to highlight. Organizations, go deploy your FIDO keys. And I'll give you the chance there as I catch a breath for our next article, John, if you've got something else you want as a public service announcement for Robinhood.
Yes. Don't let your CSRs, your customer service representatives, have the ability to allow someone to gain access to 5 million records. So the version of that I heard was that social eng that happened was through a CSR. And maybe I might be, I hope I'm wrong there, right? That should be hopefully someone social engineered, like a DBA or like some sort of administrator or someone, not like the dude answering the phone, person answering the phone saying, hey, can I help you with your Coinbase or your Robinhood? Why would a CSR have that type of access? And that's the part what sort of blew my mind on this. But and if anyone wants a good example of what you shouldn't have in your, I can't say shouldn't have. If you want to see an example of not the best way of doing a disclosure note, take a look at theirs. It's just like, it's so legalized. It's like the lawyer spent probably hours in a room on that one. But I mean, they were within their window. They hit the letter of the law. That's great, but it doesn't give you warm fuzzies. It's a little too sanitized, I think, for my own taste.
No, that makes sense. And I suppose, now I also don't have additional details on the technical aspects of the app, but I know that, for example, hitting a CSR, and then CSRs by nature need to have access to be able to view individual users' records, whether they're doing some type of, support, as you can imagine within workflows are necessary. But to your point too, if this, if they could script something, an attacker, or they can have access to enumerate 5 million records through that customer support portal without even having to get to the database, that's also something that probably should have been part of your threat modeling and should have been part of your application hardening. So, in this day and age, everyone doesn't exactly need root. They don't necessarily need access to the database if there's a nice leaky API that can pull all those records out. So, Yes, we'll keep an eye out and see if we can learn some more about it and have something additional to talk about. There is something we learned more about with ChaosDB, which I think will be fun. But before we get into that, I did want to, we'll see how brief or not this goes. There was quite a disclosure saga around a disclosure for Palo Alto Networks, their PAN-OS. And trying to make a long story short, a vendor that does red teaming had disclosed a buffer overflow to Palo Alto Networks, but the disclosure timeline just so happened to be that they discovered this overflow in November of 2020, so roughly a year ago, almost to the date, and didn't disclose it until September of this year, so a good 10 or so months later. And they took a lot of flack about what does this, how coordinated is a coordinated disclosure process if you're sitting on a vuln like this for so long. Unfortunately, there's at least I think a bit of complexity to this, because I was looking at some of these timelines, and the impacted version actually was released in October, or was the fixed version, let me rephrase that, was also released in October 2020. Now, this fix, though, in PAN-OS 8.1.17, just to try and use some numbers here to keep my mind straight as I try to describe this, it didn't know that the vuln was there, so it didn't know that it fixed the vuln. But like many lifetimes of vulnerabilities, they can ebb and flow as code changes, as small things get fixed, as bugs get fixed, but bugs might get fixed without understanding the full exploitation consequences or potential behind them. So I think a long story short, which will be my theme of the day, is that there was more, I think, an aspect here of a lot of weak patching processes, and as well as this red teaming vendor sitting on a vulnerability that, had it been known, could have accelerated some of these patch management cycles, and is the type of vuln that you can also simulate. You don't necessarily need to sit on these types of buffer overflows in order to use them effectively in a goal-oriented type of red teaming exercise, which is designed to test an organization's detection and response mechanisms more than just their patching mechanisms and process, things like that. So that was a little bit of how I saw this particular saga. John, I'm not sure how much you were paying attention to this, or if there were other things that you saw differently through your lenses.
I think sorry, I keep getting sucked into one of our next stories. This one, I was listening, and I did see this last week. I think what really sort of a head scratcher for me for a while is it took me a while to understand why they hadn't let go of it. I guess I wasn't thinking in that particular mindset last week. But yeah, they didn't release it so they could use it to pop other customers, which is pretty not great. I think the takeaway for me now, with my brain more caffeinated probably, is if I was looking to gain a few exploits in my little quiver, I might take a stab at poking around this company and seeing if I can find myself an easy way in, because I bet that's not the only ODay that they have which they haven't disclosed. So hope they got them shields up. But yeah, it was interesting that it got patched on accident. But as you said, that can happen.
That can happen. Well, now that we have your caffeinated brain, Mr. Kinsella, perhaps let's talk about that ChaosDB. This is a vulnerability. We covered it initially back in episode 164 when it was first reported by this researchers who saw Azure's Cosmos DB and were able to say, oh, there's some Jupyter notebooks in here. We can do some technical magic with them and compromise them to get into basically arbitrary tenants that are using any tenants of the Cosmos DB. Now, at the time, unfortunately, back in 164, there were no technical details. But now, 10 episodes later, they have kindly released technical details in a great write-up that walks through roughly 6 steps of just what went wrong. And now I'm going to hopefully not steal your thunder about what you want to talk about, John. But to set things up here, what they saw was that if you ran code like the default Python 3 or some other programming languages, within this Jupyter notebook, it dropped into this Cosmos user account, basically a non-privileged account. Sounds good. That's probably a good design and how things should be. What they discovered is that C# had some sharp edges, so to speak. When they executed some C# code, it was executed with root privileges, which is very strange and curious. Is this just something that's a misconfiguration, or what made C# special? But that's how that was their initial foothold, and a lot of things fell apart from there. So let me stop stealing your thunder as a storm is coming in to Mr. Kinsella. What stands out for you, or what would you like to take us on next in this journey to chaos?
I've been
Long sigh.
this one's the post is great, man. Everyone go read this. I had seen it last week, but I didn't realize they got into juicy details until I was reading it this morning. And Johnny's probably been watching me on camera for the last hour, like mouth agape, like literally just like I'm shocked.
Couple things went wrong, huh?
So let's. I'm trying to. Leave our friends in Redmond out of this, but just the very first thing they have in here, that OS was obviously not hardened. If you look at like the first or second screenshot after they got root, they do the cat etsy password, and like I was just looking through the list of accounts, like games, I mean LP, I mean no even whiff of hardening on this. Again, how if you can, we all have dirty laundry, right? It's even like the last the Robin Hood story you're talking about. I was going to say, you know how this happened, right? It's someone initially had a some sort of an account, some sort of an API, which they're like, oh, we'll make sure we take care of that before it goes out to prod, and they didn't. So now there's an API out there where you're able to get all your accounts, or some CSR have more permissions than they should have. Mm-hmm. Or they meant to put like a RBAC control on it and they forgot, or they did, but they didn't set that happens, I get it. But you can only do that so many times. And that's what this post sort of shows. You know, we talk a lot about pivot attacks, and all you need is, we use a phrase like, or I use that phrase like, like rock climbing, like I just need to get a finger hold or a toe hold in, and then I can use that to get further and further and further. This is a really great example of that, why you need to have hardening in depth. One of the first thoughts I had is, if I was running a cloud-based service as a provider, I would make sure root wasn't root, or root didn't exist in that box. That's just, I mean, hardening, man. That's sort of, and that's not ASW, right? That's just pure OS hardening. And right. Then from there on and on and on you go. I mean, I'm not sure what I can say here on an application security aspect, really. I mean, it's I'm actually at a loss for words. It's really incredible. We keep my editorializing to myself. I think it's so out there to me that, like, really just go and listen to any of our shows and you'll have a better background. Go listen to any of our shows and actually do some things we talk about. Like, just pick any of them. And you'll be in a better state than I think this was. This is very interesting, let's say. I'm actually at a loss for words, so I'm going to just stop stuttering.
No, I hear you on that one, because there is so cloud service providers should have the shared responsibility model, started by AWS, and the other CSPs have adopted that concept, and you're supposed to be sharing responsibility, not sharing root access across your systems, which is what poor John is stumbling around here. Just how
you're supposed to be good cop to my bad cop. You're not supposed to be egging me on here. It's funny because that, I probably said it on this show to a degree at some point, that shared responsibility phrase I take as a bit of a cop out. there's definitely a shared responsibility, but when that phrase started becoming popular in the last like 2 years or so, I felt like it was, I think Amazon, you're right, started using it first. I got the sense that it was Amazon saying, hey, we're not going to secure all your stuff for you. You have to, put on your big boy pants.
Right.
Which is completely true. But I remember when that first came out, it felt a little bit like there was someone was taking a step back from what they probably could have been doing. But yeah, like you said, this is shared vulnerabilities. That's vulnerabilities and scale. Yeah, I can go on all day. I'm like, mouth shut.
Yeah, no. So while we let some more of that caffeine kick in and let John's brain relax from this write-up, which is wonderful write-up, do read it. I guess some of the things I wanted to highlight from this is that if you look at what the researchers did, they basically did the living off the land in terms of poking around, pivoting, and expanding their access. Meaning, all they had to do the get root with running some arbitrary code within a Jupyter notebook. Those notebooks are designed to run arbitrary code. Just so happened that C# gave it that, I guess, there's that little sharp sign. It does not represent root. Maybe that was there's a joke in there somewhere. I'll have to work on that. Sorry. But I guess where I'm getting hit here too is your observability. One of the things that we talk about sometimes, but maybe not enough, is observability within your network, within your systems. And so you didn't need observability here to see who was running Netcat, who are running some of the obvious compromise, post-exploitation tools. Everything in here was, I think, cloud native, Azure services, Azure APIs, just being poked around with legit credentials and legit mutual certificates for authentication. So this is where you need that observability. A little bit of what we were talking about in the last segment with Ryan is, what is the activity that's going on, and is that activity suspect or suspicious or not, which is easier said than done. But if you have that capability, but if you don't have that capability, it's an area where you should probably be investing on to see, if you're flushing IP tables, that doesn't seem very common. Or if you're using your mutual TLS certificates for service-to-service authentication, that's also something that maybe you should revisit how your zero trust network is set up. And occasionally those network boundaries are in fact a good thing to have, and not just put purely onto device attestation, or for that matter, maybe increase that device attestation. So those are some of the areas I would try to pull out on the theme of application security. But at the risk of further breaking John, maybe let's go on to something also in the Unix world, but something a lot more self-contained within BusyBox. So BusyBox is a Unix. It can run on, I came across it first on Linux, but it can be ported to many things. And it's basically a suite of software tools for system administration that's very common within the IoT space because it's a small footprint. What was really neat in this article, some researchers said, we want to look for some vulns in BusyBox, and we're going to fuzz for it. So this, to my mind, was a great example of successful use of fuzzing that's identified a bunch of consequential or vulns that need to be fixed. So regardless of whether or not you're actually using BusyBox, I'm not going to be able to. I keep thinking fuzzing. That's why I want to say BusyBox. BusyBox. That doesn't matter so much as the aspect of how mature is your environment, or as mature as your SDLC process, to be able to support an approach to fuzzing. And fuzzing is also something that could be definitely beneficial to the mobile environment as well. So also have a little bit of that tie into our last segment as well. So John, this is how I'm setting up your the throw over to you. Let's see if your brain has rebooted and come out of that journey into chaos. So how are you doing over there?
I'm better. I actually there was another mouth agape after when you were talking. Thank God for mute. Yeah, that, guys, you got to go read that one. That's a good one. It's that good on Wiz. So the fuzzer stuff. I'd for a long time heard mumblings that there were potential for juiciness in BusyBox. Never really, not recently, but I've heard people say it over the years. I personally really dislike BusyBox because it will, you think you're on a Unix shell and you try some of your commands and you realize something's not working and you're like, wait, oh, it's that. The Alpine guys liked it, so I've run into it a decent amount. This is great work. I mean, the fuzzing stuff in general, we've talked about it a bunch. I've done a decent amount of work with it myself. It's expensive to do because it's expensive to set up, it's expensive to run, it's expensive to find, expensive to fix. But in many cases like this, the results are really great. Like we know, Google, we're going to talk more about Google coming up, but they've had their fuzzing service for open source stuff. It's one of those areas that, as much as I suspect a lot of people, particularly probably management, really eye roll when you talk about fuzzing, a lot of really great stuff comes out of it to prevent some of the other things we've talked about in other stories today. So yeah, no, nothing particular. I haven't looked into any of the actual issues which they found, but they found quite a few of them. It's some nice work.
It's definitely some nice work, and so and it's great to see that the work from these researchers, as you mentioned, work from Wiz about the ChaosDB. So these are a general editorial announcement to our readers out there. If you come across these types of write-ups, or if you are the researchers creating them, make sure to drop them into our Discord because we'd love to highlight more great write-ups like this. And John, you set up a great segue. Thank you, mentioning Google, which we mentioned Google quite a bit, I realize, on the show, but I think it's well deserved in this case because they were announcing this ClusterFuzzLite, which is basically a way to bring some fuzzing capabilities into the SDLC because, John, as you noted, fuzzing is easy to say, but it can be a lot harder to implement. And as I was writing up in the show notes, you definitely do need an aspect of maturity, an elevated maturity in your SDLC practices before you should dive into fuzzing. It's the type of thing that if you've just built an app and you have, you're just standing up an application security program, you don't start with an OWASP top 10 as your foundation, and you don't start with a bug bounty as your first AppSec approach, and you don't start with fuzzing because you're just going to confuse and take up all the time of your developers when they could be doing some of the better basics. But with that said, this work from Google is one of the ways to help with those better basics so that this fuzzing can then identify vulns or identify bugs. And sometimes those bugs are vulns that can be exploitable. Sometimes they're just bugs that should be fixed because they cause a crash, and that leads to software quality. So some good things to think about with fuzzing. And like the FIDO keys, I guess this episode brought to you with the word by the letter F, which we're not going to go back to the ChaosDB because I know what John's opinion of the letter F is going to be on that one. But fuzzing here is pretty good, and that's the best I can squeeze out of these two articles.
On your comment about when to use fuzz, or you need a little more maturity, the thought I had there for folks who haven't done this or might wonder why we sort of we consider it such an advanced thing. Really what you're doing is like you're covering your eyes and like feeling around in the dark, and you might get something, you might not. But if it's not set up right, or if you're a beginner doing it, you're not even sure to use your finger or a fist, right? You're really just poking around. So that's why it's sort of considered like that. I think what's interesting about ClusterFuzzLite is they're providing with the plugins for GitHub Actions and things like that. So that sounds, I think to a lot of us, it sounds very simple. It's like, oh, you just gave me a script so I can run my CI. But at the same time, that if one less thing to do, if I can just go and add an action, hell, let's do it and just see what happens. I would, I've done that with multiple other security products in the last few months. I'm like, hey, let me just create a branch and like throw an action on there, and if the action's there, let's just see what happens. What do I get out of it? So it becomes quite, I'll say quite affordable. But at the same time, the script for the action is free, but if that action is going to run somewhere, you're still going to pay for those cycles. So it's
right.
There's still a cost associated with it. But this is it's interesting, right? We talked with FuzzBuzz in the past. I was using them for a while, previous company. There's lots of folks out there trying to make. Not lots, but there's a good number of folks out there trying to make this as easy as possible, but it's still a fairly advanced thing. So any ease of use is definitely appreciated.
+1 for the ease of use. And I threw another article in here that didn't have anything timely in terms of updates or blog posts or news, but I thought it was topical in terms of talking about fuzzing and alternatives to setting up fuzzing. So this is Prossimo article I'm talking about, a project that's looking to basically rustify a bunch of consequential software applications out there. And they're the project behind putting Rust into the Linux kernel. So we're talking about the device drivers, which we talked about. I can't remember the episode, but we talked about it somewhere. We'll find out which episode that was. But they're also looking at curl, mod TLS, and NTP is the latest one that they're trying to get some funding and support for. And focusing this not so much on the idea that it's specifically Rust that's trying to be, that is a more memory safe language, but more about look at the attack surface they're tackling. Very common things like the Linux kernel. Curl, very common tool. Mod TLS, pretty pervasive. NTP, again, a very ubiquitous type of tool out there. So as we talk about maturing your SDLC and where what's the path your developers and your DevOps team wants to go, maybe they could go down the fuzzing route, but maybe, and this is why I also wanted to pull this in here, maybe we could refactor our code into something new and change it from C into Rust or Go for that matter. And I'm always a fan of refactoring, but it's once again, it's an investment to make, and that investment has to be made with your eyes open and understanding here's the engineering and money essentially that you're sinking into this type of approach. So that was why I pulled in this particular article about Prossimo and rust-proofing the internet.
I was just digging through who's funding this. The usual folks, because this is, while they're looking for help to do this work, this is it's one of those things which the results is good. It's not quite as fuzzy as fuzzing itself, but you're welcome. Still, it's important, but it's you're not just going to go and start rewriting stuff unless you got a really good reason. So thank you, Mozilla, EFF, Amazon, Bill and Melinda Gates. That's an interesting one. Facebook, OVH Cloud. I haven't heard about them for a while. So all those guys, thanks for helping fund this type of thing. It's quite beneficial for all of us.
So one of the other things that could be beneficial is looking at more C-based stacks. In this case, there was another article about Nucleus real-time operating system and the TCP/IP stack in it. And this one, again, it stood out to me as just one of those things that would be rife for fuzzing, although I don't think these researchers actually used fuzzing to find the dozen or so vulns in it. But one of the things that stood out was just how simple, like TFTP, FTP server, there's a simple stack-based overflow, so there's a lack of ASLR, I guess. So these are some things that just stood out of why do we have this type of software in this day and age? So let's fuzz more. So that's, I guess, what I wanted to hit on that one.
I wonder if you could set up a Jupyter notebook and use that to fuzz like a cloud provider. Wait, sorry. This, so first, excuse my outburst. The power is like right on the edge going out here and lights were flickering and I thought I was done, but lights are still on. Knock on wood. As I giggled, as soon as you say like, we're on a security show, as soon as you say TCP IP stack, I'm like, oh, I know where this is going.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, again, glad they're doing it, now rather than never. Wow, they got a 9.8 in there. FTP user does not properly validate length of user command. Yeah, I didn't look at this article before, but it's the standard, and these things are super important. We're usually at RTO. I mean, oh god, these RTOSs are super important, and my exclamation there was realizing that this particular RTOS runs on medical equipment. What's a teachable story here? It's how sorry, we've seen after the what was the nuclear centrifuge, I can't remember that big long, that was Siemens equipment too. I can't remember the name of that hack, but we know that these OSs, which are super critical, running on critical software, should be using something which has been very carefully looked at. So I'm a little surprised this is going on with Siemens. But it's probably, no, it's not cheaper equipment. It's life or death. So again, yeah, I'm glad to see that these were discovered. How about I'll leave it at that. There's good learning things in here for people. I think the fun thing is maybe, are any of the RTOSs open source? I think there's one free RTOS. I think it is. It'd be fun for folks to go and look at those and get a sense for, because like this and BusyBox both have that same, I'll say, mission of being very efficient with very little. They're not going to implement the full Unix or the full OS or full whatever else, but still, what they do, they have to do very, very well and very securely. So it's probably some good educational material from the point of view of you're not dealing with the whole Linux kernel with the device drivers for how many hundreds of thousands of things. You should be able to go through and see the OS a little bit quicker and understand what's going on. But that means also you should be able to point out or notice bugs a little bit easier, maybe, possibly. I don't know. I'm not saying that to shame these guys. I'm saying that as just an education experience for someone who was bored on the weekend.
No, I think I agree. I think especially if there's something as simple as these TFTP, FTP services, basically the other thing, non-encrypted services, these can also be easier ways just to do some simpler research because you're not having to jump over hurdles of either decrypting traffic, although that wasn't necessarily in any case for this, or having to work around things like ASLR or other stack hardening countermeasures. So it can also just be a little bit more fruitful, perhaps, to use another F word, of the day as an educational. So that's a great angle. And before the power goes out, John, we had HTTP smuggling for the last 2 years. We now have HTML smuggling, which is pretty cool. So it's nice to see some creative uses of HTML5, which HTML smuggling, in a nutshell, is basically using the JavaScript blob object to create an octet stream, which is I'm trying not to just say a stream of octets, but is basically a blob of bytes that can represent a binary. And so they combined this JavaScript blob of inscrutable bytes and with the download attribute that was introduced in HTML5 to essentially create a way to bypass sort of different areas of security scrutiny, different security boundaries within organizations, where it might be doing things like having a proxy that examines content, having an email proxy that examines content, looking for things like malicious software, PDFs, no longer have Flash attachments, thankfully, but there's plenty of other, as I mentioned, PDFs, plenty of other venues into a browser. And this is just pretty clever use of it. It's a fun way to just understand what are some nuances of HTML5. I don't know how pervasive it is, but Microsoft did a nice write-up for it. They've seen it in the real world, and so it's something to be worried about.
Mike, why are you worried about a browser? You're going to have JavaScript and Excel next year, so you'll be able to do this right there. Yeah, sorry. This one this is so
that's called a callback, folks. Well done.
Yes. it is the filtering is someone commented on Discord. Yeah, when's my filter gonna break? It's neat. Leave the logo off the top of the page and the snarky comments aside. All this stuff, man, it's interesting the amount of really crazy things like this you can do with JavaScript, or let's be honest, whatever language you put into a browser. Well, I'd like to think that a more sophisticated language wouldn't have these issues, but still, it's a complex language that's been made easy so that people can easily develop for the web. That's really what this is. So it's always going to have all sorts of stuff like this going on, unfortunately. But sorry, something stuck out at me on the page. It's good to think about. At the same time, do I want people to go and study this to learn where I'm going with this, I'm switching my attitude from the last two stories where I'm saying, hey, this is something you can learn from and do that type of thing. And here I'm saying, I'm trying to go towards the opposite and say, yeah, I think the longer you look at JavaScript, the more issues you go see with it. And as we have more stuff coming out, we're going to see, more craziness. But at the same time, from a defensive application point of view, I think, I don't know, I'm curious your thoughts on this, but the statement I'll put out there is I think you've not gone too far, but we're passing teachable. We're repeating ourselves with this. It's like, okay, beside the fact don't use JavaScript, but just, what could go wrong? It's JavaScript and Excel, someone in Discord. But the point being is, okay, is there something you can take away from this particular story and abstract that a little bit and use that in other languages or in the day-to-day what you're doing with application security in your organization? That's the part. Do you see something there for it? I mean, I guess sort of, okay, it's an octet stream. How you decode that's always going to be at a bit of a dicey issue. But the rest of the dressing around the JavaScript and all that type of thing is can be overlooked, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I makes sense to me, and I see where you're going. I think to me, one of the things that stood out is, I opened up the show talking about Flash, and one of the reasons Flash was replaced on mobile was the emergence of HTML5, and HTML5 had the native video player, had a lot of functionality that could replace something like Flash for many good reasons, one of which it lives within the same origin policy. So this article with HTML smuggling seems more like a failure to consider, or maybe, well, I'll stick with failure. This episode brought to you by the letter F. A failure in thinking through all of the security boundaries and how the existing capabilities that are not being abused or misused. This is just call a legitimate use, even though it's not a vulnerability or a problem within HTML or HTML5 itself. Mm-hmm. It's just a use of HTML5. So yes, I agree, and I think I see where you're trying to struggle to pull out the educational aspect. I guess more of what I would say is understand your tools or understand the tech stack to imagine better what your threat models are for the environment around it. And I'm going to we unfortunately have to wrap up soon, but throw out here for thinking to the future of, call it WebSockets, another thing out of HTML5, and even WebAssembly, which is one of the other reasons that Flash can be replaced with HTML5. And WebAssembly is something that is very much an inscrutable octet stream within JavaScript, and that can be executed within the browser, but it's also being executed on server side. We've seen instances of a sort of that server side WebAssembly running as well. So maybe that will be the take-home message for the week, with some fun homework for our listeners. I think that's the best of the theme I can do. Any final parting farewells from you, Mr. Kinsella?
One last thought on that, which would be the reason you were talking about understanding your tools, but when we're looking at something as complex as HTML5 or JavaScript, the part of the problem is like, how do you learn all about that tool, right? Usually when I'm coding or when I'm picking up a new technology, I'm the hacker mindset. I learn just enough to get done what I need to get done.
Right.
So does that mean that someone has to go and read the whole book before they write Hello World? So that's sort of how do you know what you don't know? That's one of the tricky things here for people to try and figure out. How do you get up to speed quickly?
And that's a great, let us know in Discord. How do you get up to speed, or what are the interesting aspects or surprising parts of JavaScript or HTML5 for that matter that you think are underappreciated or perhaps not as well known? And with that, I want to say thank you for John to those final thoughts. I want to thank everybody for listening and saying hi to us in Discord. We're going to see you next week on Application Security Weekly.